Well, I first visited Berlin in July 1989, actually, as a student. Um, I'd I'd recently lost my passport in a hotel fire, so I couldn't leave the island city of West Berlin. My intention was to see the DDR, which I never did. So I was in the island city, but then I came back again in November 1989 for a conference on urban ecology. Um, and I managed recently to find the papers from this symposium or colloquium, and it was quite interesting because in November 1989, clearly figures like Herbert Zukop were very prominent within urban ecological discourse. And there was this very profound sense that the island city of West Berlin had been a key international center for urban ecological work. And yet this, if you like, the island status was gradually fading in the context of this Congress in November 1989. So it was a strange moment, actually, as a student. And I actually chose to focus my research on Hamburg, not Berlin, at that time, on urban environmental themes, because my sense was that the city was in such a state of flux. It was very difficult to get a handle on what was happening at that moment. And I think that that's quite a common experience in terms of the, if you like, the historical present can be very disorienting. It's not easy to make sense of a situation that you're actually in the middle of. But anyway, I mean, my interest in Berlin has developed steadily since that time. I had a fellowship to the Humboldt University, for example, in the early 2000s, with Hartmut Heusemann was my Gastgeber, who was, you know, the key figure within urban sociology at that time. And I've had this long-standing interest in German intellectual developments, and I guess the Berlin region in particular. I guess one of the oddities for me about the coronavirus crisis is that for a while I've been suggesting that urban political ecology could say something very distinctive about urban epidemiology. And in fact, there are very few examples of urban political ecology that deals directly with some of the political dimensions of public health. And it's clearly an area that could be, in future years, could be significantly developed. I mean, the other possibility might be to connect future research on the coronavirus with the ethics of the non-human. And I'm thinking particularly of questions around both food production and industrialized agriculture, and also the treatment of animals as well. And clearly there are profound questions which are posed by the current crisis, in the sense that globally, if we were predominantly vegetarian, let's say, then we wouldn't be in this crisis that we are now. So there are some very important questions which I think will come into focus in coming months and years. I do think that there's been an overly optimistic sense that during the lockdown phase in many cities, people discussed the return of nature and the possibility to hear birdsong, things of that kind. And I think there was an overly optimistic sense that we would be moving into a fundamentally new kind of environmental problematic. And already, for example, in London, traffic levels are back to where they were effectively before, partly because people don't want to use public transport, they're using private modes of transport and so on. So I think people were maybe commenting too early in some respects in terms of the longer term environmental impact. I think it's a very interesting kind of conceptual or analytical lens to explore urban space. And I think possibly there are three main strands actually to urban metabolism discourse. So I think a first strand is the kind of systems ecology, which is linked with figures like Abel Wollman, Marina Fischer-Kowalski and others, and a systems-based approach to interpreting urban space as a system of flows, cycles, an emphasis on quantifiable data, strong interfaces between engineering, biological sciences, things of that kind. So it's a kind of a scientistic vision, if you like, of urban space as knowable and controllable. Yeah. So I think that that's one very prominent strand. I think the other strand, perhaps, which is interesting, goes right back to some of the writing of Karl Marx and metabolic rift and the emerging critique of capitalist agriculture and the loss of soil fertility, and the sense that there's a one-way irreversible dynamic through capitalist forms of environmental destruction, robbing the earth and robbing the worker. So there's a kind of a twin element here, which has been quite significant for people like Bellamy Foster and others. So that's a clear kind of strand, a kind of neo-Marxian strand in terms of metabolic rift, which I think potentially relates to questions about extractive capitalism, biodiversity destruction, and other elements of contemporary environmental change. It's not just an urban question. And possibly the third strand of urban metabolism is more related to the question of cyborg discourse and the conceptualization of the city as a kind of life support system or a complex set of relationships and structures that enables modern life to flourish effectively. So water systems, things of that kind. And I think this connects certainly with some of the work I've done. Also, geographers such as Erik Swingedal, who has really written about this. And I think on the question of urban metabolism, there's an interesting interface, if you like, between the neo-Marxian emphasis, which tends to be on the circuits of capital within the built environment, and then the cyborgian emphasis on the flow of water or other basic necessities for life. And I think some of the work that people such as Swingedal have brought together is very interesting in terms of this evolving interface between the circulatory dynamics of capital and the circulatory dynamics of water and other elements. I've been interested in some of the recent debates about remunicipalization of the Berlin water system, which I think is of profound international significance. Is very, very interesting, because I think as you look through the 1990s and the early 2000s, there was this sense of inevitability, that certain structural changes in infrastructure were impossible to resist, that the market-driven privatization wave would occur in every city. So this sense of a public culture that's sufficiently sophisticated and engaged to actually choose a different path is very, very interesting to me. And it relates to the philosophical work of Andrew Feenberg, who's been very influential for my thinking on these questions, and the idea of modernity as being a set of multiple pathways. And I think that's a really important thing to consider in relation to many areas of public policy. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about water systems as a kind of lens through which to explore urban space is that on the one hand, you're dealing with practical questions in terms of access to sufficient water, potable water, the drainage of wastewater, a series of practical, essential questions for allowing urban space to flourish. But you're also, through exploring water, I think it serves as an analytical lens to look at the social and political complexities of urban space. And I think among the, if you like, the starting points for this mode of analysis, you can talk about what Graham and Marvin refer to as the modern infrastructural ideal, and the sense that modern cities from the late 19th century onwards tended to strive towards a particular model of universal service provision and so on, very much an engineering-driven vision, but also underpinned by a particular kind of social and political constellation and a particular kind of conceptualization of the public realm. But then you find that if you take a broader view and take a more comparative view, you find that there are many cities or regions that never really experienced this modern infrastructural ideal to begin with, and that particularly in some of the fast-growing cities in the global south, this was actually always a minority or elite experience. And so suddenly you have to contend with a diversity of forms of water supply, different kinds of socio-technical assemblages operating in urban space. And people like Jochen Monstadt, for example, have investigated this in a very interesting way. I mean, returning to London for a moment, I mean, and you're looking forward to 2040, which is interesting. I mean, it seems a long way away, but suddenly it will be here. I think that in the case of London, there are some interesting questions to consider in coming back to water in particular. One is that water was privatized in London, and it's a private utility called Thames Water, who are one of the worst performing private utilities that you could possibly imagine. The rate of leakage in London has been, by some estimates, near to 40%, similar to Jakarta in Indonesia, and there are many other examples. And so it's very controversial, the mismanagement of water in London. And another point to mention in relation to water is increasing flood risk facing London, maybe linking to your other question about the Anthropocene and climatic change. It's very clear that in the future, this is going to be a major challenge for London. And one of the interesting questions for London is that in the early 50s, there was a major flood incident that also affected the Netherlands in the early 50s. 30 years later, in the early 1980s, the Thames Barrier flood protection engineering scheme was opened. So there's this 30-year delay, which is interesting, between the event and the response. And what's clear now is that the Thames Barrier is being used much more frequently than it was intended to be, that the scenarios for use are changing. And now there's increasing discussion about what happens after the Thames Barrier. And it seems that opinion is diverging between different possibilities. One possibility is to create another much larger, huge engineering structure to protect the future city. I think the larger the area, the more complicated the discussions become. And in some metropolitan regions, such as Los Angeles, you have this chronic problem with urban fragmentation and different political municipalities, and trying to find a kind of common regional vision has been a problem for a very, very long time. Yes, I mean, maybe one question to consider is this kind of tension between the material and the immaterial. And when we think about access to nature in cities, this is part of the material spaces and landscapes that people can immerse themselves in. Yet at the same time, in your questions you put together for our discussion, you're clearly interested in the digitalization of landscapes and the emergence of the digital subject within urban space. And it seems that there's an interesting set of potential tensions here over this material-immaterial interface. And I think one of the comments, the conceptual comments that's coming through in relation to the Anthropocene debate is that because we know that there are these measurable environmental changes, that the earlier emphasis within environmental discourse, particularly on constructivist approaches to nature, and the sense that meaning predominantly resides simply within language, are becoming harder to sustain now. And there's something of a conceptual hiatus even between these different conceptual responses or understandings of nature or environmental change. Andreas Malm is one of the people who has written about this in a very interesting way. I think it's both. I mean, I think that obviously digital infrastructures create opportunities, but also threats as well. The transparent society is really important in terms of thinking through the meaning of the digital subject and the way that human subjectivity is changing in terms of the sharing of information and the lack of privacy, and links obviously with the surveillance society. And I think also posing questions that go beyond the individual human subject and collective subjectivities. I think this is really interesting and important in terms of the relationships with the non-human or material spaces, and how these come together to produce different kinds of subjectivities. I think that, I mean, there are many potential angles here. I mean, I think that possibly just to return for a second to this notion of these emerging digital interfaces, I think one of the interesting questions is about the geographies of the digital capital or the digital transition in terms of faraway places and the extractive ecologies involved in producing digital infrastructures. So I think that some of this earlier phase of quite simplistic work about the material or the immaterial, or the idea that most people will be working from home and things like that, that physical interaction no longer matters. I think that we've moved through that phase now. And I think part of that, to come to your question, I think part of that is a new sense of the cultural and political dynamics of material spaces. So nature forms part of that, clearly, and ecological processes form part of that. And I think that we are in some kind of a transition that it's difficult to know exactly where we'll end up at, I think, in terms of these new approaches to understanding nature and environment. Okay, you could say that digital citizenship, if there is such a thing, involves creating new forms of inequality. And I think that sometimes the people who are really really arguing for this sort of digital transition are not really ready to think through all of the complicated implications. I know there's a link with the smart city debate that you may have been looking at as well. I think there's a emerging interface there. But I think in one of the things that concerns me, as I was suggesting earlier, is this sense that every aspect of people's lives is gradually sucked into these algorithms or algorithmic space, and attempts to not only manage or steer patterns of human behavior, but actually this data harvesting dynamic is, I think these are the things that worry me, I think, in terms of the smart city, and also in terms of the interests served, and how, and I think coming back to this question about the multiple pathways as well, that whether these algorithms really make it very difficult for a fully functional public sphere to enable people to, or communities to choose different pathways because of the interests that are bound up with this. In terms of navigating spaces, I think the sort of GPS technologies and so on can maybe give people almost a false sense of spatial security in terms of being able to navigate space or track space in certain ways. But I think if we slightly shifted the emphasis towards the idea of a digital public realm, I think there's interesting thinking here in relation to the environmental sphere. There are possibilities for the sharing of expertise in interesting ways in terms of biomonitoring, for example, tree disease, where people can, you have a citizen science dynamic where people can take photographs of trees or leaves, and then the data can be analyzed in some way. In terms of biodiversity, the Cornell lab for ornithology has been very significant in terms of collating global sources of publicly sourced data and things like that. But there is always this tension, in a sense, about how scientific programs are created or funded, and what kind of questions are posed that, if you like, public enthusiasm or expertise can be gathered through these digital platforms or interfaces, but to what extent do individuals or the public have a role in determining what's actually being investigated. I think that becomes more complicated, perhaps. I think it's potentially very interesting. I mean, one question for me is whether if you have greater public participation in environmental monitoring, so that, if you like, the individual citizen or environmental citizen in some formulations has more knowledge, more understanding, more engagement in these questions, does that feed through into a different kind of political dynamic? And I think that's something which is potentially very interesting, and it has been happening in some locations. The environmental justice movement in North America has been quite prominent in terms of linking grassroots expertise or data gathering with broader social and political questions about land use planning, for example. So I think there are important ways in which the sense of environmental data gathering, sometimes through digital technologies, not always, but sometimes through digital technologies, can feed into a more scientifically enriched environmental discourse. I mean, I think one way to look at things in terms of changes over time is the idea of the urban palimpsest, in terms of these successive layers of infrastructure systems. And sometimes past infrastructures can take on a new kind of role, integrated into innovative park design, for example, or abandoned railway lines become new walkways, pedestrian walkways through the city. There are imaginative things that can be done with fragments of the past rather than simply erase spaces. You mentioned the case of the Braken and some of these interstitial spaces. Something that I find very interesting is the question of time and landscape, and the way an abandoned space changes in a very interesting way over time. And that, I think, attracts a lot of cultural and scientific interest in these non-designed spaces. And of course, there are some landscape designers, such as Gilles Clement, who have harnessed the temporal dynamics of spontaneous vegetation as part of very sophisticated landscape design. So there's an interesting synthesis, if you like, between design and non-design, which has become quite prominent in some recent projects. Well, I mean, in Berlin, I mean, Park am Gleisdreieck is clearly a very interesting example of a synthesis between these different approaches to landscape design, in the sense that there are fragments of the original abandoned spaces which have been kept. There are spaces which have been artificially created to mimic lost spaces. And then there are more conventional areas. And I think that one of the things for me that really strikes me about a space such as Park am Gleisdreieck is that, in a way, it's ecologically quite sophisticated, this design. And its synthesis of the cultural and the scientific is quite impressive. But I think, on the other hand, the park can't prevent these wider changes and rising rents and neighborhood change around it, so that in a way it's ecologically more successful, or aesthetically more successful than it is politically successful in terms of protecting a particular kind of public realm within the city. And maybe an example like Park am Gleisdreieck really illustrates the limits to urban design as a way of solving much more deep-rooted social and political challenges in the contemporary city. The design maybe ultimately is not the answer in terms of the kind of broader questions that you're asking. I mean, I think when we're reflecting on the future or thinking about future cities, I've sometimes used the expression the ecological imaginary. And sometimes some of the most insightful reflections about the future come outside the academic sphere as such. So literature is important. So the science fiction writer J.G. Ballard, for instance, is an example of somebody who has explored what he sometimes refers to as the near future in a very interesting way, and sometimes posing questions that sometimes absent within more orthodox kind of social science or engineering paradigms and so on. So I think in that sense, then you could say that the arts and literature and cinema have a really important role to play in terms of expanding the ecological imaginary and thinking about alternative futures. This particular novel, High Rise, written in the early 70s, it's about a luxury housing development next to the River Thames, where this very elite housing development begins to effectively fall apart as infrastructures within the building fail and conflict erupts between the different residents. And the structure of this luxury apartment has the more higher earning or higher status individuals towards the top of the building and other people living further down. Weirdly enough, university professors live quite near the top of this building in the early 70s, which would be very different now, of course. But in those days, but the whole dynamic within the building starts to crumble, and I think it's a typical Ballardian kind of plot in a way that as the infrastructure systems fail, then the social and political tensions are revealed. So he was, I think in his writing, he was very interested in the way infrastructure systems frame modernity, but also render modernity vulnerable at the same time. And Ballard also wrote quite a lot about abandoned infrastructures. You mentioned in your earlier question, abandoned swimming pools for Ballard were some of the most interesting features of urban space. And he was very fascinated with, because he saw them as, in a way, traces of former civilizations, the sort of puzzles, so archaeological puzzles to be explored in some of his writing. I think there's a sense, not just in the work of Ballard, but many others, that when infrastructures function, nobody notices them. A few specialists take an interest, but when infrastructure systems fail, then suddenly they're dramatically revealed through interruptions to water supply, electricity, or other things. In a similar fashion, you could say that a public health crisis suddenly reveals things that were previously hidden. It's a particular kind of disruption of modernity that's experienced. So this, I think, dates from the 1960s, and it's basically a standard engineering map of the city, and it's a specialist cartographic representation of urban complexity. And I think that it's one of these somewhat mysterious, but actually I think aesthetically it's quite intriguing. It's with it the detail and the accuracy of the representation, and it also reflects, I think, a particular urban imaginary based around the modern infrastructural ideal and the sense of a very complex, highly sophisticated functional system that, coming back to the earlier point, most people wouldn't be aware of. They wouldn't have any idea about the layout of pipes and things under the streets and things of that kind. So this is the kind of, this is part of the hidden realm of urban complexity, which I think has been very fascinating for infrastructure studies. In some cases, these kind of maps have been deliberately destroyed. So my understanding is that the Portuguese colonial authorities, when they withdrew from Angola and Mozambique, systematically destroyed maps of this kind to make it much more difficult for future governments to manage urban space. So they're actually quite precious commodities that can be withheld or destroyed in order to create particular forms of urban disruption. With many structures or systems, there's an opening, there's a brief moment of public interest, but then in coming years or decades is the question of how to maintain or enable these systems to function for a very long period. And I think that whole question of maintenance then becomes quite interesting and important. Partly also another interrelated factor maybe is that maintenance of many structures is not as profitable necessarily as other short-term investment cycles. So when we talk about neoliberalism in the city, there's quite a lot of research suggesting that these maintenance aspects have been relatively neglected in relation to other forms of investment in the built environment, which, if you like, builds up a series of tensions that can potentially emerge at a later time. Yes, of course. I mean, I think that building a vibrant public realm where complex ecological and engineering questions, technological questions can be discussed and debated is really important. I think that's very important. But at the same time, I think that there has to be some acknowledgement of the nature of scientific or technological expertise. And I feel worried, for example, in the public health realm, to return to your earlier questions, when you have a free flow of misinformation, which can actually make it quite difficult for the public realm to have a fully informed discussion. And I think that's, so I think that the sense of what expertise is an important question to reflect on. It's an ontological question, it's an epistemological question, and I think it loops back to the sense of what a different kind of future environmental citizenship might consist of. I think that this, in a way, it relates to several different strands of what we've been talking about. And also your opening question about the link between Berlin and my own work, because this is a site that greatly interested me for a number of years in the Chausseestrasse. When it was eventually, it's a classic marker, if you like. It's a site where the former Berlin Wall once stood. At the time at which I was looking at it, it was in a way at a peak of ecological diversity and so on. And it was interesting to me that it was already used as a kind of vernacular public space, but gradually the site was damaged or divided up. Part of it was used for a parking space, various hoardings or fences were put up at certain points. There was a kind of classic process of urban enclosure to make it more difficult for people to enter the site. And then ultimately there was a housing development put up here, luxury housing development, when the advertising for the development made use of very similar aesthetic imagery of like an urban meadow and things of that kind, which of course no longer existed. So for me, at least, it was an interesting entry point into this sense of the process of the abandonment and commodification of urban nature and ecological aesthetics. It raised many, many interesting questions for me. And from a methodological point of view, I've sometimes found in my own work that one specific site can serve as a kind of inspiration for thinking through a set of broader questions. So in London, to give a slightly different illustration, there's a site called Abney Park, which is actually a cemetery, which is also a nature reserve. And I found this a very fascinating space to reflect on some of these different questions affecting urban space and urban nature. Because many of these marginal spaces are now being lost, then some of the most important spaces for urban biodiversity seem to be in spaces such as cemeteries, because they have a very complex topographic structure. In some cases, they've been there for centuries. So you have this ecological continuity. And in Berlin itself, actually, some of the ecologists who had previously focused on these Braken or post-industrial spaces have moved their attention towards cemeteries. Ingo Kovarik, for example, and other people connected with the technical university, the cemeteries have become a really important part of their research program.